Kyle Luzynski graduated from St. Louis University with a bachelor's degree in philosophy and a minor in marketing. He also studied business management and entrepreneurship. Since 2018, Kyle is executive director at Project Animal Freedom, where he directs marketing campaigns and manages the day-to-day activities at the nonprofit organization. Thank you so much for being here today, Kyle.
Absolutely, it is our pleasure.
And so I want to first talk about how you found veganism in the Midwest. It's always admirable when those of us who are living in more challenging places, surrounded by agriculture and all the pressures that brings. How did you find the vegan path?
By the sheerest of improbability, one day I came home from school after being ridiculed in gym class. I was just 12 years old in sixth grade, and I decided I would cheer myself up by watching some lighthearted videos on YouTube. Instead, I found undercover videos of factory farms and slaughterhouses. Once I saw what happened to animals, I could never eat them again.
Wow, that's a good journey. And so you were bullied, and then you saw that others are being bullied as well.
Yes, absolutely. I did not make the connection between the bullying and the egg industry and the dairy industry until several weeks thereafter. I was eating this instant meal. It was some type of Alfredo meal, and I realized that the cheese they used for that had rennet in it, and that's when I formally renounced all animal products. I also revisited all those horrifying, harrowing videos I had seen, and ever since then I have been a vegan. It took several weeks for me to realize that being vegetarian was insufficient and to make the switch to fully vegan.
Several weeks is not a long time. It took me 10 years, so congratulations. Good for you. Good for
Thank you.
you. And so, how has that kind of empowered your being? How does that change the way you interact with those folks who would bully you, or how do you how has it shifted your perspective on the world?
Oh, it has radically shifted, and it's fundamentally altered the course of my life, because my mission now is to end every factory farm and every slaughterhouse by the time I die. Had I not seen those undercover videos of factory farms and slaughterhouses, I would not have found my purpose in life. I now lead a purpose-driven life precisely because of those videos. And again, it was by the sheerest of improbability they should not have appeared in my search history. They should not have appeared at all, but there they were. Thank Mother Earth for whoever conducted those undercover videos, and thank whatever glitch in the internet enabled me to see that based on my search terms. How has my perspective shifted? It's gone from one of naivete to one of intimate awareness of complicity. I recognize now that every single human animal and every single human establishment is inextricably connected to the oppression of non-human animals. Just right here, you can see the pavement. We have paved over the natural world, and in order to pave over the natural world, we had to rip out the trees of the grass that lived there, along with the animals who relied on those parts of our ecosystem. So, and it, urban sprawl is another issue that's displacing wildlife. I happen to live in a neighborhood in Eureka, which is a suburb of a suburb out about half an hour outside of St. Louis, and it's rather traumatizing to me to see these forests that I grew up in, these forests that I explored with my pepper dog, who lived to the age of 16 before dying when I was in 12th grade, to see the forests being torn down strip by strip to make way for new housing development. My perspective is now one of much greater awareness as to what's happening to animals and the natural world. In fact, I discovered veganism first, and I did loosely advocate for veganism until about the age of 18, when I took on environmentalism even more heavily and wound up founding the Environmental Club of Merrimack at the college that I attended. Veganism was very much a gateway into greater awareness of all the issues of oppression. And it was the gateway into anti-oppression as well. Because I'm vegan, because I recognize that harming the most innocent, defenseless, and vulnerable among us is not justified, I can extend that compassion to other vulnerable, victimized individuals in our society.
Right. And when you talk about, destroying forests for housing and for agriculture as well, and yeah, and we think of the big creatures, the bears and the wolves and the deer, but there are so many tiny little creatures in the forest as well that we really that we all depend on this biodiversity, and it's being destroyed. It's very scary indeed. All right, so Project Animal Freedom, you're on location today, and it's a big day for you folks. Can you tell us about Project Animal Freedom and what you're doing today, Kyle?
Absolutely. Project Animal Freedom was born on October 19th, 2018. I had to make the difficult but ultimately liberating decision to leave behind a nonprofit I had worked with for several years and had served as the president of the board on with that nonprofit, to found a new organization that I hope would succeed precisely where they failed. I am pleased to report that Project Animal Freedom is thriving, and our goal is to reduce as much animal suffering to the greatest extent possible, something I was unable to do at my former nonprofit. I couldn't even get us to agree on the basic metric of what we ought to accomplish.
Hmm.
Um, but Project Animal Freedom has completely reshaped the course of my life, because I'm now able to pursue my dreams through this organization. For example, we're organizing Gateway to Compassion Fest, which is the world's first large-scale intersectional vegan-themed social justice festival. I'm
Huh.
able to do so much that I couldn't when I was micromanaged at my former organization, and I'm so grateful to all the friends who convinced me to found Project Animal Freedom. Now that we did found an organization is one thing, but to justify the existence of that organization is another. What makes Project Animal Freedom unique? What justifies us starting a new organization rather than joining forces with another organization? And we finally have several answers. First of all, we're radically intersectional, which many organizations within the animal rights space are not. Second of all, and more importantly, we are dedicated to building the movement at the grassroots level. PETA sits atop a pile of $50 million a year. That's roughly their annual operating budget. But how many local PETA activists do you know? How many PETA chapters are there? There are corporate offices located, I believe there's one in Maryland and one in Los Angeles. But where's the grassroots movement? Where are all the chapters? Where are all the events? I do know that there are traveling activists with PETA, but they come out maybe once a year for a day or two, for a few hours, and you go out to eat and then they drive away. That's about all we see with PETA. And I don't mean to impugn PETA, but to use them as an example. So much more could be done, because in the Midwest, there are 58 major metropolitan areas with a human animal population in excess of 100,000, yet only 15, 1 in 4, feature a local animal rights organization. There is this vast unrealized potential at the grassroots level to affect change. And if you ask me, I believe that small actions, when multiplied by millions of people, can change the world. At Project Animal Freedom, our mission is to build the movement across the Midwest, is to open chapters, is to create and mobilize activists, is to host one day hundreds of events a year, trying to get people to go vegan and participating in pressure campaigns that try to change not just individuals, but also institutions, because often you can reap a far greater impact by changing institutions. Change the institutions and the people will follow. For example, we are working on our plant-based pledge, and the goal of which is to convince fellow social justice advocacy organizations to take a stance against factory farming, namely by issuing a position statement that factory farming is bad and we ought not support it. We also hope to kindly, at least at first, pressure these other progressive social justice advocacy organizations to opt for plant-based options at their event and divest from animal cruelty as far as is possible. Project Animal Freedom therefore operates on a number of interesting levels. We're not just interested in building the animal rights movement across the Midwest. We're interested in networking with other social justice movements to build a movement of movements. And as we've seen, as with the push for civil rights in the 1960s and the anti-war efforts in the 60s and 70s and onward today, the most impactful movements engage as many people as possible across as broad a spectrum of issues as possible. And the issues connected to animal agriculture are overwhelming and profound.
Yeah, I heard someone describe it as like if you draw a Venn diagram and animal farming, using animals, animal exploitation is at the center of all these other, equality and feminism and Black Lives Matter and equality rights and all of that. So I really respect you guys for acknowledging that. There's that's one of the challenges within the movement is to make sure that we're all inclusive and acknowledging each other's struggles. And I kind of feel like, whatever your passion is, if you're an activist for whatever, you still start with being vegan, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's crucial that we take as thorough an anti-oppression stance as possible. And if you are able to eat a plant-based diet, then you ought to eat a plant-based diet. There are a number of socioeconomic factors in particular and structural factors in the distribution of food and the affordability thereof that can make access to plant-based foods more difficult, and in some cases radically more difficult than it ought to be. But for the vast majority of people, um, a mid-level income or higher, a plant-based diet should be entirely accessible. That said, there are plenty of low-income vegans who exist as well. We shouldn't erase their existence. You can eat a plant-based diet on a minimal budget. It is possible, but we also recognize that it can be difficult. Now, when you're speaking of fellow activists, they have an obligation, especially if they identify as intersectional, to embrace animal justice, and through embracing animal justice, denounce factory farming and renounce their support thereof. Because non-human animals, or rather more than human animals, are horribly oppressed in factory farms, animal labs, slaughterhouses, fish farms, fur farms, and on and on and on. And if we claim that we support justice for all, there is no rational way to exclude more than human animals. If we do exclude more than human animals from our purview and from our activism, then we are advocating for justice for some. And many in the social justice movement, broadly speaking, are convinced that there can be no justice unless there is justice for all, that none of us are free until all of us are free. If you are an activist, if you support social justice, and especially if you identify as intersectional, you ought to be vegan as a matter of moral consistency.
Right.
And justice.
And yeah. And so, all right, let's start with the meetup that you're doing today. Then you're in Springfield. You've traveled to Springfield. So this is part of your outreach then. And so you're hoping that folks are going to show up for kind of an initial meeting of the Springfield chapter of Project Animal Freedom?
Yes, and the real hope is to recruit several chapter organizers who can help carry our work in Springfield forward, because we need a strong grassroots movement in every major metropolitan area uniting together to pressure institutions to do what they ought to do, to divest from animal cruelty as far as is possible. that requires a sustained network of activists. And the way I view it, there's only so much one fat vegan can do. There's only so much I personally can do, and it's up to the people who attend today, in particular, people who've already expressed interest, people who are already connected to the local community, people who know the local community much better than I do as a St. Louis native, to step up into a leadership position to help carry our work here in Springfield forward. There is so much unrealized potential in Springfield, and I was rather disheartened to learn not only that they don't have any animal justice organizations other than your typical animal shelters and so on and so forth, the animal welfare side of the coin, but their broader social justice movement is also much more fragmented than in St. Louis. Understandably so, because the Springfield metropolitan area is roughly 1/5 the size of the St. Louis metropolitan area. But our hope is to engage the pre-existing social justice community in a number of ways that is inclusive toward them. For example, back in St. Louis, we are about to create an event page for our St. Louis Climate March, and we would love very much to see the same take root here in Springfield, Missouri. So we're working with environmental advocacy organizations and all the environment adjacent organizations, wildlife conservation organizations, and so on and so forth. So we're trying to strengthen multiple movements at all, but with our primary focus on animal justice. And it really is up to other people to help carry the movement here forward, because there's only so much one fat vegan can do.
It's wonderful what you're doing, and I have no doubt you're going to be successful. So I have questions about the journey then from Eureka to Springfield. You know, I'm from rural Alberta originally, and it used to be that you would see cows and other animals out in the fields, and then you would see just miles and miles and miles of crops for animals. I think that's changed now, so you just don't see the animals anymore. You see the factories, and then but you still see the acres and acres and hectares of these land used to grow food to feed to animals, or bedding or that sort of thing. Is it much the same on your journey from Eureka? Is that kind of what you see?
Not on this particular stretch of the journey, because southern Missouri is mostly covered in forest.
Oh, nice.
And you would have to go up into northern Missouri. If you go to northern Missouri, there is much more agricultural activity because the land tends to be flatter. Why does the land tend to be flatter up there? Because during the last ice age, the glacial mass that covered much of the northern hemisphere extended to about midway down Missouri, and it ended roughly where the Missouri River is today. So it's in northern Missouri where most of the agricultural activity takes place. But if you drive elsewhere in the Midwest, it is just endless rows of corn. Endless rows of corn. Not so much on my journey down here to Springfield, but if I were to go to Illinois, endless rows of corn. If I were to go to Iowa, endless rows of corn. If I were to go to Kansas, some grassland, and then endless rows of corn. And in many places, it reeks. You can actually smell the factory farms. I'll never forget when we were driving through Kansas when I was a young child, probably just 8 or 9 years old, before I discovered the source of that stench, before I discovered veganism. I could smell it across all the fields. And I asked my parents what it was, and they said, that's manure. But little did I realize just how profound the problem of intensive confinement of animals was, just how much waste it produces and how noxious that waste is to the environment. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, about a quarter of all U.S. river miles, that's miles of river here in the U.S., are contaminated, seriously so, by factory farm runoff. In fact, about a quarter of all river miles in the U.S. are so contaminated, there's an advisory against swimming in the water. And I've even seen out here in southern Missouri cows wading into the river. So sometimes there is not just factory farm runoff, there's direct pollution of animals wading into the rivers. And what a magical experience it was to be in a canoe floating down maybe the Jackson Fork, I forget exactly which river, and to see a cow just wading in the middle of the river. They let us approach, and they did not move at us, and we did not touch them, but it was a very unique experience for me to see that cow. But then it was heart-wrenching to realize that in a matter of months, they would likely be strung upside down with their throat slit in a slaughterhouse.
That's the only reason they're brought here, ultimately. That's the only reason that they're brought here, whether it's in a factory farm environment or in a grass fed environment. That's their ultimate destiny. So there's a lot of talk here. I don't know if it's the same there about regenerative agriculture, this idea that we can open up these factory farms and just graze these animals and let them live free, and that somehow that's more humane and that's going to be something we're going to be able to do. Is that a discussion that's happening there as well?
In St. Louis, I am aware of one individual who presented at the Ethical Society of St. Louis on the topic of Alan Savory's regenerative agriculture concept of rotational grazing. And by the end of that presentation, not only was I furious, but the ethical leader of St. Louis, Kate Lovelady, fortunately, recognized that the entire presentation was based almost entirely on pseudoscience, and that there is, in fact, no way to sustainably raise billions upon billions of more than human animals for human animal consumption. There's also a book that I would strongly recommend people read titled Food Choice and Sustainability by Dr. Richard Openlander, who has consulted with many of the most significant documentaries produced in the animal rights canon, including Cowspiracy, Seaspiracy, and many others. In this book, he presents the most complete account I have yet encountered of all the reasons why there simply is no sustainable way. You can slap any label on the animal product you want, and he delineates the evidence that, in fact, we're using far more resources to raise animals for food than if we simply raise what the animals eat, plants, for food. So at its foundation, not only is it unsustainable, but I would also argue it's unethical. Because even if you assume there was somehow a sustainable way to raise innocent creatures and kill them at a fraction of their natural lifespan simply because you like the way their dead body tastes, there's no justice. Sustainability is only one measure of justice. We need to respect the rights of future generations, but we also need to respect the rights of current generations. We could, for example, sustainably cull hundreds of babies in factory farms that raise babies to the ripe, tender weight of 11 pounds, 8 ounces, and then serve up these humanely raised, sustainably sourced babies for human consumption or the consumption by lions or whatever. Just because something can be done sustainably doesn't make it ethical. There are many dystopian novels that explore the idea of killing people in their 20s or 30s or putting them through intense trials and tribulations during which they will most likely die. But there's just no ethical way. We have to respect the rights of current generations as well. And since animals desire to live, and they have a prima facie right to life that we ought to respect. They have a meaningful interest in continued existence. What happens to them matters to them. They care what happens to them. Therefore, they have a meaningful right to life that we have to respect. And you cannot respect someone's right to life if you're killing them at a fraction of their natural lifespan just because you want to eat their dead body.
And also, I would argue forcefully bringing them into this world. You know, there's nothing natural about the reproductive process on any animal farm, as far as I understand. It's forced breeding. When I had a horse and made the decision to impregnate her, which I now regret, but she had to be tethered and tied to a fence, and I mean, so there's, and that was nice in comparison to what goes on in these factory farms. So yeah, we need to take a really good look at what's happening there. As you mentioned, it's a naive approach that we go through life just consuming and not knowing what's going on. So on the other hand, a lot of people are raised on these farms, and this is their life, and this is what they know, and this is their work, and they raise families of their own, and it goes on through the generations. That's probably your biggest challenge, I would think, is, there's jobs there, right? And there's livelihoods, and there's tradition. How do you approach those folks?
Last weekend, I forked out over $300 so I could travel to Wichita. Why? Because it's Movement Builder May, and we have donors to please. Really, I thought it would be intensely symbolic if we opened our third ever chapter and our first ever chapter outside of the state of Missouri in Wichita, Kansas. But before we could do that, I had to speak with a fellow activist named Diane Waltner, who's been running the Wichita Animal Rights Group for many years now. And while I was there, after we met, I took an Uber to get back to my motel, and the driver asked me, like, why I'm in Springfield, because I mentioned I was on a business trip. And I told him that I'm with this group called Project Animal Freedom, and we're trying to open a chapter not only in Wichita, but all across the Midwest. And I flew in for this opportunity because I wanted to see this happen during such a symbolic, such a meaningful month for our organization. And he asked me, what about the farmers? You're coming after their jobs. What about them? And fortunately, we had just arrived, so I was able to kindly depart without getting into a heated argument with him. But it certainly is a challenge, especially across the Midwest, where a disproportionate share of farmers and factory farmers in particular live, to try to find meaningful employment for them beyond the animal agriculture to which they have grown so accustomed. I also worked with the Green Party of St. Louis and gave their keynote address at their 27th annual Green Pesto Feast. I did not give the most compelling presentation in the world, but nevertheless, Don Fitz, who has headed the Gateway Green Alliance, and by extension, the Green Party of Missouri for many years, to draft legislation of sorts that would outline their plan for transitioning farmers into plant-based agriculture or other jobs that don't involve raising and killing animals for profit. Unfortunately, at Project Animal Freedom, we don't yet have a program that supports farmers specifically. We do know that the ethical case is overwhelmingly sound, and that the ecological case is uncontestable, but we don't yet have a program that specifically targets farmers and helps them transition. However, there are other organizations within the movement that are working with farmers to help them find gainful employment beyond the animal industry. One of them that comes to mind is the Agriculture Fairness Alliance. A couple individuals and one sanctuary also comes to mind. Howard Lyman, the Mad Cowboy, and also Rowdy Girl Sanctuary, which was founded by somebody who was a farmer, somebody who raised cattle down in the heart of Texas, who ultimately came to compassion and had this profound epiphany that they could not send their final batch of cattle to slaughter, and instead opted to open this animal sanctuary to tend to them until the end of their days. There are other organizations doing this work, and it's my hope that their operations will not only expand, but Project Animal Freedom will find opportunities to collaborate with them to help further their impact, particularly within the Midwest where we're based.
Cool. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about the role of government because I know there are massive subsidies that go to these farmers. First of all, I wonder if they didn't receive those subsidies, might they be more inclined to transition? And then, secondly, I noticed that you had a speaker from Canada's Animal Protection Party. You've done some really great webinars, and I would invite people to check out your webinar series. And you spoke with Stephen Best. I unfortunately missed that presentation to talk about animal exploitation and COVID. And so I know that there is an Animal Justice Party USA that promotes candidates at all levels of government in the US. We don't really hear about them. We hear about the Green Party a little bit outside of the two corporate parties. So I'm curious, what do you think of Canada's Animal Protection Party and the US Animal Justice Party? And do you think that that's a viable solution to start to invite these candidates at all levels of government? Would that make a difference?
We need a political solution. The overall trend of the animal rights movement has been 30 to 40 to even 50 years of protesting in the streets. And what do we see? We see largely stagnant numbers. Veganism has exploded over the past few years, but when you step outside our vegan echo chamber, you realize just how little progress has been made in many areas of society. In fact, much of the progress that we've made has been co-opted by large corporations. For example, the Impossible Whopper? It's a great development that supports people transitioning toward veganism, but ultimately we're enriching a mega corporation that does not care about animals. And many of the products, including silk and so many others on grocery store shelves that we celebrate as symbols of progress, are again owned by mega corporations that not only don't advocate for veganism, but are directly implicated in the use and abuse of, in some cases, millions, hundreds of millions of animals. So what we need to do is not just focus on individual choice. Individual choice will only get us so far. We need to focus on political solutions that create change very quickly at a societal level. And we can look to other social justice movements to see why it's so necessary that we engage with the political landscape in order to affect meaningful change. We can try to tackle the issue of climate change, for example, one by one by riding a bike instead of driving a car, by eating a vegan diet instead of the standard American meat-laden diet. And we can try to plant dozens of trees each year to help offset other carbon pollution. But what we need is governments mandating, for example, that all cars by 2030 be electric, and that coal power plants be phased out and replaced with solar systems. And as you mentioned, subsidies. We need massive subsidies for green energy, and we need massive subsidies for the humane economy. Right now, I believe 90+% of all subsidy money that goes to agriculture is going not just to it's not going to grains, it's not going to fruits and vegetable farming, it's going to animal agriculture. The animal agribusiness is artificially propped up by tens of billions of dollars of taxpayer money. Even if you're vegan, some of your money is going to prop up the animal abuse industry. And in fact, a large reason that they exist to the extent they do today, why there's such a supply of animal products, is because of these subsidies. Without these subsidies, for example, the author of Meatonomics estimates that a Big Mac at McDonald's wouldn't cost $3.99. It would cost closer to $13.99 if you removed all the subsidies that allow these industries to use cheap grain, rent land, grazing land at a ridiculously reduced rate. I think about 1/14 the standard going rate for other uses, and just billions of dollars in government buybacks. If there's a surplus of animal products, the government will buy the excess milk and the excess butter and the excess cheese and the excess meat back to again help support this dying business. There are large demographic changes that are occurring that threaten the future existence of the dairy industry in particular. But as long as tens of billions of dollars of subsidy money is being pumped into the animal abuse industry, they can survive largely intact. Now, that requires political action, and that requires people willing to advocate for such political action. As you mentioned, there are two corporate parties that have a stranglehold on politics here in the US, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And within those corporate parties are sympathizers to the animal abuse industry. People who you think would be allies in the Democratic Party were bought out and or sold out to the animal abuse industry long ago. They support the animal industry through and through. Even people like Bernie Sanders have supported legislation that helps artificially prop up the dairy industry. So you can't rely on the two corporate parties to make progress. You can try to infiltrate them, and I believe that's the most viable strategy. But I also believe that we need to support third-party candidates who can win smaller elections. And even then, it can be very difficult. Our former board president, Tavon Brooks, ran for alderman of the 21st Ward in St. Louis. And if you don't list as a Republican or as a Democrat, you don't get listed on the ballot. You're an independent, and independents don't get listed. Third-party candidates don't get listed either. So even if you can run a legitimate third-party campaign and you have a shot at winning at the local level, just based on the demographics of the area and the policies that you support, sometimes there are additional barriers that make it very difficult. And unfortunately, in the US, there truly is this corporate duopoly stranglehold on power. And I don't see a third party even getting onto the debate stage for a long time, which is why I think infiltration is the best movement. We need to infiltrate the Democratic Party and the progressive wing in particular, and get them to exercise power. I know so many progressives and leftists who are thoroughly disappointed by the failure of the squad, who we adore in so many respects, to, for example, force a vote on Medicare, or to reject Biden's stimulus bill until it reinstates the $15 minimum wage provision. They have this political power and they're not exercising it. So what we need to do, at least in the US political landscape, is infiltrate the progressive movement, find allies within the progressive movement, and get people who are willing to actually take firm action to make things happen. We cannot stand down because we're the only people standing up.
Okay. I follow U.S. politics because it's fascinating and it affects us, especially here in Canada, as well as the rest of the world. And I would just say that, the squad were the infiltrators, and look what happened to them. It's like the Democratic machine swallows them up. So, are you familiar with the People's Party? There's quite a large movement of people who are, as you mentioned, just fed up with the sellout of Bernie Sanders and all the rest of them, and they've created the People's Party. And I've been to some of their events, and they talk a lot about electoral reform, this problem that you speak of trying to get on the ballot, trying to get on the debate page. Debate stage, Ralph Nader has been ostracized forever for daring to run as an independent or with the Green Party. But the People's Party doesn't seem, I've never heard them say anything about animal agriculture, but they are growing in popularity, it seems.
Absolutely. But I think that we're going to encounter many of the same issues. Uh, it's sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. And unfortunately, I don't have the solution other than mass grassroots organizing. That's the only solution I have to the various crises facing the world. And of course, politics is a vital part either of the solution or of either of the problem or of the solution. Um, and that's why right now I don't necessarily know what exactly Project Animal Freedom needs to do next to have the largest impact possible for animals. But what I do know, a prerequisite, something we're always going to need, is a strong, vibrant, thriving network of activists, a movement of tens of thousands of individuals. Now you can apply that to contemporary political issues, such as electoral reform and abortion rights, reproductive justice, and environmental legislation, and so on. I think that we animal rights activists have to operate in every political sphere we can, and we have to take a seat at every table that we can. We should work with the Green Party, we should work with the People's Party, and we should work with the Democratic Party, especially the progressives, because other organizations are flexing the political might. Other groups of Americans, even if they're relatively small, are flexing their political might. Just look at the default support that roughly 3/4 of Congress has expressed for Israel, despite Israel's many war crimes, despite the horrible things that the Netanyahu, dare I say, regime has done to the Palestinian people. There is still this mass support, despite the fact that just a handful of American Israelis and a handful of lobbying groups are trying to influence the political landscape. And as Stephen Best said during his presentation, many of these fringe radical groups, like guns rights extremists at the NRA, are able to wield such massive political influence, and we're not able to wield any. I bet you that the NRA is reaching out to Constitution Party members, is reaching out to libertarians, not Democrats, because they're very unlikely to gain support there, to try to advance their agenda. And I believe that animal rights activists and animal rights organizations, especially 501c4 organizations, need to do the same. We need to engage with politicians as much as is possible, and we need to lobby Congress and build the Congress that we need to help pass this legislation. That's why I'm very supportive of organizations like the Vegan Justice League. Again, I think this is a situation where Project Animal Freedom has our hands tied, mostly as a 501c3. That fact that we're a 501c3 cuts off so much of our potential political campaigning activities. But I do know there are other organizations like the Vegan Justice League that can try to influence politics more effectively than we can. And I know that at the root of it, we're going to need a massive grassroots movement. Never doubt the power of millions of people acting in unison to overthrow unjust forces. That's the only thing that I believe truly can.
It's the only thing that ever has, that's for sure. And yeah, I just want to say, recognizing that there's a problem with the political systems, and in Canada as well. We need electoral reform as well. Recognizing the problem of animal agriculture, animal farming, is also a part of the solution. We can't solve anything until we figure out that there's a problem, for sure. So just we're gonna wrap up soon. I'm trying to envision. So you have a very grand vision, Kyle, and you're reaching out across the Midwest to set up grassroots projects for Project Animal Freedom, individual. So are you looking to sort of oversee each of those groups and set an agenda for each of them? Or are you going to kind of let them take on whatever role? Maybe one area wants to go after transitioning farmers, helping them transition, and maybe another group wants to take on government, another one takes on corporations. Are you seeing that it's allowing them to work wherever they're able? Is that the idea?
Yes, there will always be baseline expectations and some core objectives in which all chapters will need to be engaged. But Project Animal Freedom was founded so that people could pursue their passion projects. At my former nonprofit, all my ideas were shut down, chronically so and disturbingly so. I don't want to get into all of that. I would rather forget it even happened, but I'm just enormously happier here at Project Animal Freedom because we are able to engage in so many different advocacy efforts that were closed and shut down before when I attempted them. Freedom is in our name, and we want our activists to be free to pursue their passion projects. It's part of our officer's promise. I will support the endeavors of my fellow activists as fully as I can. And I also do believe there needs to be some diversification in what is going on. We need specialists to carry forward much vital work because right now, for example, we have an operations committee that oversees so much of what we do. We oversee marketing, we oversee fundraising. This committee oversees leadership recruitment. It oversees financials. It oversees events. It oversees everything. And what we're finding is that we're growing so rapidly and taking on so much work that 90 minutes or even 2 hours, as the meetings often stretch to 2 hours in length, twice a month is not enough. And what we need to do is start diversifying. And let's say that there is a leader in our Wichita chapter who really wants to take on helping farmers transition to plant-based careers. We should encourage them as much as is possible, give them the resources they need, and give them the freedom to pursue that passion project. As I like to tell leaders, you're free to do whatever you want as long as it reasonably aligns with our core values.
Right on. Kyle, this is very exciting what you're doing, and thank you so much for doing it. So, just quickly then, what are some activities that you've got planned that people could look forward to, maybe online, and where can people go if they want to get involved with Project Animal Freedom?
Absolutely. You can learn more about our organization at projectanimalfreedom.org. And you can also buy some awesome t-shirts if you go to projectanimalfreedom.org/shop. And coming tomorrow, there will be several new Pride themed t-shirts, which I'm extremely excited about because I am a big fat gay vegan. And it's about time there were t-shirts that catered to my population. And our website is constantly growing and evolving. I update it almost every Wednesday and add something new. So our website is the best resource after our Facebook page to learn more about our organization, how you can get involved with it. Now, some of the exciting events we have coming up, I think the one that I'm currently the most excited about would be our St. Louis Climate March, because that's where we're going to test our theory. Can we convince fellow environmental advocacy organizations to coalesce not only around the need to champion action against the rapidly worsening climate crisis, but meaningfully include animal rights as part of the solution, meaningfully include veganism as part of the solution. So I'm very much looking forward to our St. Louis Climate March, which will likely take place on Saturday, September 25th in downtown St. Louis. And believe it or not, there is a void, even here in St. Louis, the 20th largest metropolitan area in the entire US. A climate march hasn't been organized in St. Louis for about 3 years, from what I can tell. No climate marches by any group. But the people are out there. and the organizations exist. What we need to do is bring people together. And what I'm really hoping to see is this comprehensive social justice solution that champions the rights of everyone, no matter their sex, sexuality, skin color, socioeconomic status, site of origin, senescence, and yes, even species. To that end, the next event I'm most excited about is Gateway to Compassion Fest. It is, as I mentioned, the world's first large-scale intersectional vegan-themed social justice festival, and we hope to bring together dozens of organizations from every corner of the of our collective social justice movement. There are going to be gay rights, LGBTQI plus rights organizations, trans rights organizations, animal rights organizations, reproductive rights organizations, Black rights organizations, civil rights organizations that are all going to come together under one umbrella for the mutual realization of collective liberation. The goal is to take intersectionality to its conclusion and try to get everyone together in one place. As long as you are a qualified representative of a bona fide social justice movement, you should be at Gateway to Compassion Fest. And this, again, is also a test of our theory. Can we convince fellow social justice advocacy organizations to meaningfully embrace veganism and include it within their organizational philosophy and practices? That's why I'm so excited about Gateway to Compassion Fest, because it has the potential to prove what exactly our movement is capable of.
Cool. So awesome. And so when is Gateway to Compassion Fest?
Uh, Gateway to Compassion Fest is scheduled from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. CST on Saturday, May 28th of 2022.
Oh, okay.
We have just under a year to go.
All right. Well, that should be huge and wonderful, I'm sure, as everything that you do seems to be, Kyle. Thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for taking the time today. Appreciate it a lot.
Very much, Janine, for having started this initiative during the pandemic.
Absolutely.
And of course, for the opportunity to speak.